The Denver Broncos have officially moved off of Russell Wilson, and they are now officially entering their rebuild. So today, let's talk about the Denver Broncos and why I think they're actually taking the right steps in the rebuilding process. So the way we're going to be breaking this video down is going to be breaking it up into a couple segments. We'll start off with why this team is heading in the right direction as a franchise. Then we'll talk about the opposite, why they may not be heading in the right direction. And then at the very end, we're going to talk about my synopsis for this team and what I think this team could do in the 2024 NFL season. Let's begin. So when we look at the Denver Broncos and what they've been through the past couple of seasons, we obviously know it has not lived up to the expectations. When they signed and traded for Russell Wilson, the expectation was that he could head into a team that was already built to succeed and take that team to the glory land. But then obviously the first year happened, and with a different head coach, it just never worked out. Now that was both on the coaching staff and on Russell Wilson, so the expectation was in year 2 with Sean Payton, it was going to get better and Russell Wilson was going to play similarly to how a guy like Drew Brees did when he was with Sean Payton. And then last year happened, and at times it looked good, but for the most part throughout the entire season, it was kind of a disaster the entire time. So they decided to move off of Russell Wilson and brought in some new quarterbacks, which is one of my favorite things about this franchise. Now what I will say about this quarterback room is I think it's both a positive and a negative. We'll talk about the negative side here in just a little bit. But when you look at this quarterback room, there's actually a ton of talent. Bo Nix was their first round pick in this year's draft, and I think Bo Nix is a very quality player. He was somebody who I don't really know if I would have taken him as early in the first round as they did. Again, we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. But regardless of how you feel about him, he is a talented quarterback who I actually do think will fit nicely in the Sean Payton system. Behind him, you have Jarrett Stidham, who's been a very solid backup, and honestly, when he does start, he's actually been pretty solid out there on whatever team he's on. So I think a guy like Jarrett Stidham could easily be the starter week 1 and then eventually maybe get replaced by a Bo Nix. And then their third string quarterback is Zach Wilson. And I know he's been terrible for the New York Jets, but what I will say about Zach Wilson is this: the kid has talent. There was a reason why he was taken with the 2nd overall pick. So if there's any team out there that can get some level of production out of Zach Wilson if need be, it would probably be Sean Payton. Now, unfortunately for Zach Wilson, this is not the most talented team out there, so it's kind of similar to a system he was running down there in New York. But the system for Sean Payton is so much easier than whatever the Jets were running. So if a guy like Zach Wilson does get playing time, it should be easy for him. Next thing I like about this team is their proven head coach in Sean Payton. I know Sean Payton can be sort of a controversial figure within the NFL and honestly within the Denver Broncos community, because yes, he'll go out there and he'll put together some really solid game plans sometimes, but then he'll come into a press conference and just say some of the most bizarre things in the world. And it was very clear that last year he was not really happy with the situation going on down there with Russell Wilson and everything that he was doing. And I do think that was sort of the start of the conflict between some of the fans and Russell Wilson and some of the fans and Sean Payton. But my thing with Sean Payton is he has a very fun and easy system to learn for most quarterbacks. I'm not saying that I could learn it or you could learn it, but for like an NFL quarterback, it's a pretty easy system to work within. And he's a proven head coach who knows how to run plays and how to run defenses and how to manage the clock and how to manage the game. He's just a really good head coach who has been through the thick and thin with the New Orleans Saints and Drew Brees, obviously winning a championship and having countless playoff runs. When you're a rebuilding Denver Broncos team, to have a head coach who is like that, who's been through the thick and thin, it's got to be somewhat of a relieving feeling to know that he has been there and that you can take that team to where they want to be. The next thing I like about this team is overall, I think the defense is pretty much the more talented side of the ball. Offensively, you have some studs like Jonathan Cooper, John Franklin Myers, Zach Allen, Alex Singleton, Caden Stearns, Brandon Jones, and Pat Surtain. I'm not saying all those guys are bona fide stars and eventually going to be all pros, maybe outside of, like, of course, Pat Surtain, but there's still a lot of talent on this team. I didn't even mention Jaquan McMillan. It's a younger defense that, while missing a couple stars and a couple key positions, I don't think it's that far away from actually being one of the better units in the NFL. Like, if you add a very solid cornerback alongside Pat Surtain, a star pass rusher in the defensive line, and maybe one Pro Bowl level linebacker on this team, I know that's a lot to ask for, but if you can find those in the draft or in free agency, you're talking about a top 10 defense, and this already might be a top 15 defense without those pieces. Does this defense have some issues? Yes, of course, like every defense does, but I don't think this defense is that far away from being actually really solid. The last thing I'll talk about before I start talking about why this team might not be heading in the right direction is it's a very young team overall. Like, yes, you do have a couple older players like Cortland Sutton, and at this point, guys like Garrett Bowles have been in the league for a couple years now. But when you look up and down this roster, it's a bunch of guys who are within the first 5 years of their career. Obviously, the quarterback room is very young with guys like Bo Nix and Zach Wilson. The running back room is fairly young with guys like Audric Estime and Javonte Williams. The receiving room with guys like Troy Franklin and Marvin Mims. Your offensive line is who they are, and I actually think it's a pretty solid unit overall. Just maybe some work on the interior needs some work. Defensively, you're not that old either with guys like Zach Allen, Jonathan Cooper, Pat Surtain, your two safeties from UT, Jaquan McMillan. It's a team that has a lot of talent even behind those guys. Guys like Jonah Ellis in this year's draft, Drew Sanders, Riley Moss. All key contributors on this defense, and I think that with them being as young as they are, it's going to give them a lot of chances to prove themselves within the next 2-3 years as this rebuild continues. And for a team that's trying to eventually compete for championships, to be this young and to be able to add veterans next year and years beyond that after the Russell Wilson contract moves on, it's got to be a good feeling to know that you already have this much talent already. But now let's look at the bad, and we're going to start off with the personnel issues I have with this roster, because this team does have a bunch of glaring needs. For starters, I think this team could definitely use a new influx of weapons. Right now, your starting tight end is Adam Troutman, who I don't think is the worst tight end in the world, but he only had 204 yards and he's been drafted back in 2020, so it's not like this is a young guy or anything like that. I do think that going out there and getting a tight end in either the free agency or in the draft should be a top priority for them in this upcoming offseason, so the next one. I'll just say this, I think Brock Bowers was available, don't quote me on that, but I think he was, and that would have been a great pick for the Denver Broncos. Looking at the receiving room, I do like the young pieces with guys like Troy Franklin and Marvin Mims, and obviously you have some veterans in there like Josh Reynolds and Cortland Sutton. I think next year that receiving room is going to be pretty solid overall and will get the job done, but I do think that as time goes on with Bo Nix, you want to add another wide receiver into this receiving room to add alongside Troy Franklin and Marvin Mims. Looking in the running back room, you have Javonte Williams, who last year really wasn't that impressive. Coming off of some injuries, he only had 774 yards with a 3.6 average. I'm not willing to necessarily give up on Javonte Williams per se, but I also will say I think there's a need for a new running back at some point within the next 3 years. Behind him, you do have Audric Estime, who I don't love Audric Estime. He's a big bowling ball who struggles with making quick cuts, but I do think there's some talent there with Audric. But beyond the weapons, you need a lot of help with the left guard position. I'm not a big fan of Ben Powers. Also, the center position with Luke Wattenberg definitely could use some replacements there. On the defensive line and in the defense, you're going to need to get a new cornerback alongside Pat Surtain and Jaquan McMillan. You're looking either for potentially like a slot guy or just a cornerback 3 to play on the outside alongside those guys. And then on the edge, you really just need that one star who can just be a 10 to 15 sack per season type of guy. A guy who can play alongside guys like Jonathan Cooper and Jonah Ellis and John Franklin Myers. But beyond that, one of my bigger complaints I have with this team is I don't love the Bo Nix pick. Now, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here, so if you're not interested in hearing this, you can just skip ahead and just wait till the very end of the video when you can hear my synopsis. But my opinion of the Bo Nix pick is this. I think that Bo Nix is a good quarterback, and I do think he's a good fit within the system of Sean Payton. I just think this team has so many other glaring needs, especially with what players were available in this year's draft, that you should have taken one of those guys and either traded potentially into the second round to get Bo Nix if he was available, or just target a 2025 quarterback with your first round pick next year. Because I look at that 2025 quarterback class, and while it's not nearly as talented as this year's class, there are some guys who I'm looking out to potentially be entering into that top 10. Guys like Carson Beck from Georgia, Jalen Milroe from Bama, Quinn Ewers from Texas, or Shedeur Sanders from Colorado. All those guys, in my opinion, are really talented players, and while I don't necessarily know how they would stack up to this year's draft class, I will say, I think those guys could also play very well in Sean Payton's system. So if you were the Denver Broncos, with your pick, you could have potentially taken a Laiatu Latu, a Quinion Mitchell, a Terran Arnold, maybe something inside the interior of your offensive line. And yes, it would suck that you would have a quarterback group of Jarrett Stidham and Zach Wilson, and yes, you would probably be a terrible team and win 1 or 2 games, but I kind of feel like if there's any franchise that would really benefit from having a terrible year, it would be the Denver Broncos. And I'm not saying they're going to have a good year all of a sudden because they have Bo Nix, but I'm saying if there's a team that should have went 0-16 or 0-17 to go out there and get a quarterback of next year's draft, that would make a ton of sense. Because again, I don't think this team is just a quarterback plug and play away from being a competitor. This team still has a bunch of glaring needs, and I don't think they're anywhere close to being the best team in that division. I think they're honestly closer to being the worst team in the NFL than they are to even being a top 20 team in the NFL. So going out there and taking Bo Nix in the first round when you potentially could have traded back in that draft to get even more draft capital, or they could have just taken the best player available and take a quarterback in next year's class, was a bit of a questionable decision. I understand yet again that Bo Nix was a good quarterback prospect and fit the system of Sean Payton nicely. I just think there's better options on the table there, especially for a Broncos team that needs a big influx of talents. And of course, the last bad thing about this team, and I'm not going to spend any time on it, is of course the Russell Wilson dead money. Nothing much you can do there. You already made the decision. You already made the cut. It was the right decision to make. It just happens to be that it's unfortunate that it's going to ruin your cap space situation for the next couple of years. But now let me give you guys my synopsis. How good do I think this team can be? I'm going to give you guys two sides of the spectrum. I'll give you guys the spectrum of like worst case scenario and the spectrum of like best case scenario. I think worst case scenario, Bo Nix isn't very good. Jarrett Stidham is your starter for most of the year, and you end up winning like 1 to 2 to 3 games next year and end up with the first overall pick, which may honestly be the best case scenario for this franchise. I'm just giving you the perspective of like wins or losses. I think best case scenario, where you get the most wins, Bo Nix or Zach Wilson or Jarrett Stidham play really good next year and you win close to 8 games next year. Do I think there's any chance in hell this team makes the playoffs? No. Do I think there's any chance in hell this team gets to 8 wins? I'll say maybe. I doubt it. This team needs a lot of talent, but I do think their coach and quarterback system could be okay next year. So you guys tell me, how good do you guys think this Bo Nix led Denver Broncos team will be? And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button. But I love you guys. Peace.